They left her barefoot in the snow, a torn hospital bracelet still clinging to her wrist, and 2 tiny graves behind her. The wind howled across the empty fields, lifting her bloodied nightgown like a ghost's banner. She stumbled forward, arms wrapped around her hollow stomach, eyes burning from the frozen air, or maybe from the betrayal. Behind her, the house she once called home glowed warm with light. Inside, her husband was already laughing with another woman, their silhouettes flashing against the curtains. He had told her it was her fault, that weak women made weak children. He had dragged her out by the hair when she couldn't even stand on her own, and when he threw her into the snow, slamming the door shut behind her, it sounded like the final crack of her broken heart. She sank to her knees, the cold biting into her skin, her breath coming out in shuddering clouds. It would have been so easy to lie down, to close her eyes, to disappear. But just as the darkness began to pull her under, headlights cut through the storm. A truck door slammed, boots crunched over the snow. And then, rough hands, smelling of leather and earth, lifted her gently off the ground. A deep voice, thick with an accent she couldn't place, murmured, "I've got you, darling. You're safe now." Before we go any further, I need to tell you something. 97% of the people who listen to my stories never subscribe. If even a small part of today's story touches your heart, please consider subscribing. It's free for you, but it means the world to me. Now, let's continue. The town of Dry Creek wasn't on most maps anymore. A sun-bleached patch of dust where the paint peeled off the saloon shutters and the church bell hadn't rung in years. Horses kicked up clouds of red dirt, and the only music came from the squeal of rusted windmills turning in the hot, bitter wind. Everyone knew everyone in Dry Creek, and everyone knew her, Claire Bennett, the girl who had everything and then nothing. The sheriff's daughter, the beauty with the dimpled smile who once sang in the choir. The girl who, some whispered, must have done something terrible to be punished the way she was. Now, when Claire limped down Main Street, the result of a difficult, dangerous childbirth that stole her twins and shattered her body, shutters tilted closed. Conversations clipped off mid-sentence. Children were yanked by the wrist to the other side of the street, as if grief were a disease that might jump from her torn skirts and wild, empty eyes. The limp was bad enough, but it wasn't just her broken body the town hated. It was the silence around her. The way she didn't cry at the funeral. The way she didn't scream when her husband Thomas Reed threw her out of the house less than 2 days after she buried her babies. The way she didn't defend herself when the rumors started, that she hadn't wanted the twins, that she'd cursed her own womb. Claire knew what they said. She heard the whispers curling through the cracked windows of the general store, slithering across the bar at the saloon, hissing from the pews on Sunday morning. God doesn't take good babies. Maybe it's for the best. Someone like her shouldn't be a mother. Thomas deserves better. A real woman. She heard it all, and said nothing. The truth was heavier than words anyway. The truth was that Claire had wanted those babies more than life itself, had named them Noah and Grace, before she even knew if they were a boy and a girl, had sewn tiny quilts with trembling hands, humming lullabies into the thread, had dreamed of rocking them by the fire when the winter storms rolled in. Instead, all she had was an empty cradle gathering dust in the corner of the abandoned house, and a body that still ached every morning like it remembered carrying 2 tiny souls. If this is breaking your heart already, you haven't seen the worst yet. Tap subscribe. I've got another truth waiting for you tomorrow. Claire didn't have friends anymore, only whispers that followed her like shadows. Even the pastor's wife, who once gave her extra hymnals to carry, now crossed herself when Claire walked by, muttering prayers under her breath. The saloon was the only place that didn't chase her out, probably because Thomas Reed spent enough there to buy silence. Claire didn't drink. She didn't even sit. She would just stand outside sometimes, clutching her threadbare shawl tighter around her bony shoulders, listening to the laughter inside, feeling the loneliness eat at her from the inside out. It wasn't always like this. There were days she almost remembered what it felt like to be loved. Thomas had once smiled at her, had once pulled her onto his horse and told her she was the most beautiful thing west of the Mississippi. But that was before the money dried up. before the drought turned the fields to dust, before Thomas began to see her belly growing as a burden instead of a blessing, before every failure in his life had a face, hers. The last straw came the night the twins were born, a long, bloody night of screaming and prayers in the midwife's grim face. By sunrise, there was no crying, no tiny fists waving in the yas. Air, only stillness. Thomas hadn't even looked at them, had only looked at her and seen failure. And when he grabbed her wrist and dragged her across the floor, she was too weak to fight. He threw her into the snow like a sack of garbage, the door slamming shut with a finality that sounded like a gunshot. She didn't remember much after that, only the cold, the unbearable weight of loss pressing her down, 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 and then headlights, boots, strong arms, the cowboy who changed everything. But at the start of this slow, aching chapter of her life, Claire had no idea that rescue was coming. No idea that anyone would ever look at her again with anything but pity or disgust. At that moment, she was just another broken woman, limping through a town that had already buried her alongside her children in their hearts. Another ghost, wandering Dry Creek, with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. The first time Claire saw him, he wasn't riding into town like some storybook hero. He was leaning against the rail outside the blacksmith shop, arms crossed, hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. Dust clung to his boots and the seams of his worn jeans. A battered truck, cleaner than most in Dry Creek, idled quietly behind him. He didn't look like a man who needed anyone. And yet, when Claire limped past, clutching a sack of flour to her chest, he looked up. Really looked. Not with pity, not with judgment, not even curiosity. Just recognition. Like he saw something the rest of the town had missed. Like he knew exactly how it felt to be kicked so hard by life that you forgot how to breathe. Claire dropped her gaze quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept walking, the uneven boardwalk slapping under her boots, and told herself, it didn't mean anything. Strangers passed through Dry Creek sometimes. They bought a whiskey, tipped their hat, and moved on. But when she reached the general store and risked a glance over her shoulder, he was still watching her. It wasn't until 3 days later that they spoke, or more accurately, that he spoke, and she almost didn't. Claire was coming out of the church, her arms loaded with second-hand blankets she had volunteered to wash, when the bag slipped from her weak grip. Blankets tumbled into the dust. Immediately, voices behind her clicked like shutters. Mrs. Landry, the mayor's wife, clucked her tongue. Young Annie Porter stifled a giggle. No one moved to help. Claire bent awkwardly, her bad hips screaming in protest, trying to gather the blankets before they soaked up the dirt. A pair of boots stopped in front of her, before she could even lift. Her head, rough hands, careful, steady, gathered the blankets and pressed them back into her arms. She looked up. Into the stranger's eyes. They weren't the ice blue of a villain or the soft brown of a saint. They were green, sharp and clear, like pine needles after a rain. You're carrying too much, he said simply. She opened her mouth, ready to protest, but the words tangled behind her teeth. Instead, she just nodded once, gripping the blankets tighter. He didn't smile, didn't tip his hat like some showy cowboy. He just stood there for a beat too long. Long enough for Mrs. Landry to hiss behind her fan, and for Annie Porter to nudge her friend, giggling again. Claire's cheeks burned. She turned, mumbling a thank you so low she wasn't sure he even heard it, and hurried down the steps. Her limp more pronounced with every step, every whisper snapping at her heels. But when she risked another glance back, he was still standing there, arms crossed again, watching her. Not judging, not pitying, just seeing. The stranger's name, she learned by accident, was Colt Maddox. He wasn't a drifter. He owned the old McAllister ranch on the far edge of town, land no one else wanted because of the rocky soil and bad water. But Colt didn't seem to mind hard things. Didn't mind being on the outskirts, half in and half out. Rumors started the way they always did in Dry Creek. Colt Maddox had money, people said. Real money. Bought the ranch cash, no loans. Had horses shipped in from Texas. Had some past he didn't talk about, army maybe, or something worse. The women gossiped over pie at the diner. The men muttered at the saloon. The preacher prayed extra loud on Sundays, but Colt didn't care. He didn't come into town much, and when he did, he kept to himself. Except for Claire. It wasn't anything obvious. He didn't walk her home or buy her things or call out to her in the street. It was subtler than that. The way he would tip his hat slightly when she passed, to her and no one else. The way he always seemed to be standing nearby when Thomas Reed swaggered too close with liquor on his breath and cruelty in his eyes. The way she felt, for the first time in what felt like forever, safe when Colt was within arm's reach. But safety wasn't trust, and trust was something Claire had buried alongside Noah and Grace. So when Colt finally spoke again, more than a few words this time, it rattled her harder than she expected. It was late afternoon, and the town was emptying out, the sun sinking behind the hills like a dying ember. Claire was walking home from the laundry, where she scrubbed sheets for pennies when she heard the crunch of boots behind her. She turned. It was him. He didn't say anything for a second, just held out a small brown bag. Inside, she realized, after a confused pause, was a pair of sturdy work gloves and a thick bar of soap. "For the washing," he said simply. She stared at the bag, then up at him, her throat tight. "No charity," she whispered, surprising herself with how harsh the words came out. Colt's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Wasn't charity," he said. "Was payment for saving me from that gossip henhouse back there." He tipped his head toward the church steps, where Mrs. Landry and her flock still lingered like vultures. Claire didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Instead, she nodded once, took the bag, and kept walking. Colt didn't follow. He just watched her go, and somehow that small mercy, that lack of pressure, meant more to her than a dozen pretty words. But danger was never far behind kindness in Dry Creek. Thomas Reed had been watching too. He saw the way Claire stiffened when Colt was near, saw the way Colt's eyes flickered when Thomas bumped into her a little too hard at the Mercantile. And Thomas, drunk on whiskey and rage and the fear of losing the last thing he could still control, started making plans. Plans that didn't end with kindness. Plans that smelled like gunpowder and blood. But Claire didn't know that yet. Not fully. All she knew was that for the first time in what felt like forever, the wind in Dry Creek didn't just carry dust and cruelty. It carried hope. Thin, fragile, but real. And it smelled a little like leather and soap. Before we dive into the story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. If you enjoy how it sounds, let me know in the comments so we can keep the same voice in future videos. The first time Claire stood at the edge of Colt Maddox's land, she almost turned back. The old McAllister ranch wasn't much to look at, not yet. Fences sagged. The barn leaned at an uneasy angle. The house was a battered frame, its roof patched with tarps and prayers. But the land was stubborn, alive. Weeds clawed their way up through cracked earth. Wildflowers nodded along the dry creek bed, as if daring the world to try again. Colt stood on the porch, hammer in hand, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt, and when he smiled, a real, slow smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, Claire's knees nearly buckled. "You coming to work or just admire the scenery?" he called out. Claire lifted her chin, banishing the fear clawing at her belly. She hadn't come for charity. She hadn't come to be rescued. She had come because it was time to live again, or die trying. Without a word, she limped up the cracked steps, brushed past him, and grabbed a hammer from the battered toolbox. Colt chuckled low in his throat. "That's what I thought." They built slowly, both the ranch and something between them. Claire mended fences while Colt rebuilt the barn's rotting beams. She learned to hold a paintbrush steady even when her hand ached. He learned to read the set of her shoulders and bring her a canteen before she asked. Sometimes they talked. About small things, weather, horses, old recipes. Never about the past, never about the broken things. And sometimes they didn't talk at all. They worked side by side in easy silence, the kind that filled the hollow spaces without smothering them. At night, Colt lit a fire in the old stone hearth, and they sat near it, sipping strong coffee and watching the flames dance. Claire hadn't realized how much she missed simple things: warmth, company, hope. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone who saw her as more than a scar. Of course, Dry Creek didn't approve. Whispers grew sharper. Mrs. Landry and her brood took to openly crossing themselves whenever Claire walked by. The preacher spoke of sinful unions and fallen women without ever daring to say her name. And Thomas Reed watched it all with a slow, simmering rage. It came to a head one stormy evening, just as the first spring rains tore across the plains. Claire was helping Colt patch the barn roof when Thomas rolled up in his rusted pickup, tires spitting mud. He staggered out, bottle in hand, shouting curses that cracked through the air like thunder. "You think you're too good for me now?" he bellowed, weaving toward the barn. "You think you can shack up with some fancy rich cowboy and forget who you are?" Claire froze halfway up the ladder. The hammer slipped from her grasp, clattering to the dirt below. Colt was on the ground in a second, stepping between her and Thomas with the kind of quiet, dangerous calm that made men think twice. "You've said enough," Colt said, voice low and steady. Thomas laughed, a broken, ugly sound. "You gonna fight me, Maddox? You and your cripple?" Claire flinched. Colt didn't move, didn't shout. Just stood there, fists loose at his sides, waiting. Thomas took one stumbling step closer, then another. And when he swung, wild and mean, Colt caught his wrist midair and twisted gently but firmly until Thomas dropped the bottle. "You're done," Colt said. "You don't come out here again." Thomas sneered. "She's damaged goods. You'll see." And with that, he lurched back to his truck, spitting gravel as he tore away into the storm. Claire stood frozen on the ladder, heart hammering, not from fear, from shame. Not because of Thomas's words, but because a tiny broken part of her believed them. Damaged goods, ruined. What kind of man deserved to inherit her mess? That night, after the fire was built and the rain drummed against the patched roof, Claire sat staring into the flames. Colt worked quietly nearby, cleaning tools, patching an old saddle, giving her space. Finally, without looking up, she whispered, "You don't have to pretend." Colt glanced at her, one brow raised. "I'm not," she faltered. "I'm not what you think I am." He set the saddle down and crossed the room, crouching in front of her so she had no choice but to meet his eyes. "I know exactly what you are," he said, quietly. "A fighter. A survivor. A woman who's stronger than anyone gives her credit for." Claire shook her head, tears blurring the firelight. "You don't know the things I've done. The things I couldn't save." Colt reached out, hesitated, then brushed the backs of his fingers against her cheek. Featherlight. "You didn't lose them because you were weak," he said. "You loved them. That's more than most people ever do." The dam broke. Claire pressed a fist to her mouth, sobs tearing free, ugly and raw. Colt pulled her into his arms and held her through. His hand cradling the back of her head, his heart thudding steady against her ear. He didn't promise it would be okay. He didn't offer hollow words. He just stayed. And for the first time, Claire realized she wasn't broken beyond repair. She was burned, scarred, but still standing, still breathing, and maybe, just maybe, still capable of being loved. Spring bled into summer, and Dry Creek watched with sour faces as the ranch slowly came back to life. A fresh coat of paint, fences mended, Colt bought a pair of pregnant mares, and Claire, to her shock, found herself laughing out loud when one of the foals kicked free and tumbled into the grass. They were building something together, not just a ranch, a life, a home, and with every nail hammered, every horse saddled, every quiet cup of coffee shared in the early dawn, the fire inside Claire burned a little brighter. But the past wasn't done with them yet. Late one evening, Colt came back from town with shadows in his eyes. Claire was feeding the chickens when she saw him ride up, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. She wiped her hands on her skirt and met him halfway. "What is it?" she asked. Colt hesitated. "There's a man looking for me," he said finally. "From back east." "Who?" Claire pressed, heart tightening. "A lawman," Colt said grimly. "Or something worse." He wouldn't say more, only that before he came to Dry Creek, he hadn't always lived clean, had debts, regrets, mistakes that might now cost him everything, and maybe cost her too if she stayed. "I won't bring trouble to your doorstep," Colt said, voice rough. "If you want to walk away, Claire, I'll understand." Claire looked at him, really looked, the man who had seen her when no one else would, the man who had handed her a hammer instead of pity, the man who had knelt in the dirt beside her broken dreams and helped her build new ones. And she realized something simple and staggering. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of the whispers, not of the past, not even of loving someone enough to fight. For them. Claire squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not now, not ever." And when Colt pulled her into his arms, when he kissed her like a drowning man finally finding air, Claire knew, the fire inside her had returned, and this time nothing and no one could put it out. The town square had never been more crowded. Dry Creek's Founders' Day was usually a quiet affair, pies cooling on tables, children running barefoot through dust, and old men whittling sticks in the shade. But this year, there was an edge to the air, a hum of tension. Because word had gotten out, the stranger who'd rebuilt the old McAllister ranch, the rich cowboy no one trusted, was wanted, and he wasn't alone. Claire stood near the steps of the town hall, heart hammering. Every eye burned into her, back, full of suspicion, of judgment. She could feel the townsfolk drawing a line in the dirt. Him or them, and she knew Colt felt it too. He stood a few paces away, hat pulled low, shoulders tight with battle-born instinct. If the lawmen showed up today, if Dry Creek decided to handle things themselves, Colt would be ready. But this wasn't a fight Colt could win with fists or a fast horse. This was about something else. Loyalty, belonging, choosing. Claire clutched, the locket around her neck, the one that held the only picture she had of her lost twins, and breathed deep. "I won't let you do this alone," she whispered under her breath. She was done hiding, done apologizing for surviving. If they wanted to cast stones, let them. She was stronger than their shame, and when Colt turned toward her, not the crowd, not the lawman dismounting from a distant horse, but her, Claire felt the ground steady beneath her feet. He crossed the square in 3 long strides, boots kicking up little clouds of dust, and reached for her hand, held it tight, held her tight. And when the sheriff, puffed up with self-importance, barked, "Colt Maddox, you're wanted back east on charges of fraud and resisting arrest." Colt didn't flinch. He raised Claire's hand in his own, lifted it high for all to see. "I ain't running," he said, voice carrying across the square. "Not from the law, not from my mistakes, and sure as hell not from the woman I love." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Landry dropped her pie. Someone muttered a prayer. "But Claire," Claire laughed. A bright, defiant sound that cracked through the heavy air like a bell. She stepped forward, voice clear. "And I'm not hiding anymore." The sheriff looked uncertain now, glancing between them, the gathered townsfolk, the preacher shifting nervously, near the pie table, because the truth was, Dry Creek didn't hate sinners. It hated anyone who didn't kneel. And today, Claire and Colt were standing tall. In the end, the sheriff muttered about legalities and paperwork and rode out of town before supper. In the end, Dry Creek did what it always did, pretended not to see, not to care, so long as nobody made them change. But Claire didn't need their approval. She had her choice, and she had made it. A month later, under a blanket of stars, Claire and Colt, married on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house. There was no preacher, no fancy cake, just a circle of wildflowers, a handful of real friends, and a promise. Colt slipped a simple silver ring onto her finger, hands trembling slightly. "You're my home now," he whispered. Claire smiled through tears, resting her forehead against his. And you're my second chance. The foals they had raised together watched from the pasture, tails flicking lazily. The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere deep inside Claire's chest, something broken knit itself whole again. Later that night, as the first cool winds of fall whispered across the plains, Claire pulled out the old locket. She opened it, touched the worn faces inside, and whispered, "They would have loved you too." Colt wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss into her hair. "Someday," he murmured. "Maybe we'll fill this house with new laughter." Claire closed the locket, tucked it close to her heart, and turned to kiss him. Not because she needed saving, not because she was broken, but because in this wide, wild world, they had chosen each other, freely, fiercely, forever. And when the first snow fell that winter, Claire stood barefoot in it, laughing as Colt chased her across the yard. She wasn't a curse. She wasn't a ghost. She was someone's miracle all along. She was never a curse. She was someone's miracle all along. Subscribe, and let me introduce you to the next miracle tomorrow.